Well, let me welcome you tonight to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at Harvard's Kennedy School. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, though I'm not exactly sure what title I should use. Doctor, Professor, Assistant Secretary, Ambassador, Jindai Fraser. Professor Fraser's topic tonight is Solutions, a Transformative U.S. African Policy. We're welcoming Jindai home as a member of the family of the Kennedy School, where she taught and did her research from 1995 to 2001. She's an outstanding example of what the school aspires to in the combination of serious policy-relevant scholarship on the one hand, and pragmatic, progressive policymaking on the other. After completing her PhD at Stanford, Jindai decided to accept Harvard's offer and come to the Kennedy School. I received a phone call, as she remembers, from Condi Rice, who was then the provost at Stanford, who instructed me, quote, "Take good care of Jindai. She's destined to be a star if you don't screw it up," close quote. Okay. When Jindai was here, we did our best to take Condi's wise counsel. As an academic, Jindai has focused on one of the most difficult conundrums in policy-relevant political and economic development. Why do developing nations so often fall victim to coups and civil wars? The consequences of this instability politically for the lives of citizens and for the economic development of these countries has been devastating. Prescriptively, Jindai has asked what arrangements within developing countries make coups and civil wars less likely. Surprisingly, our answer focuses on the security forces inside these countries and their civil-military relations. Before Jindai could complete her book on this subject, which had developed these arguments in a number of articles, little did she know that for the next 8 years of her life, she was going to be transported to the center of policymaking in the United States government as it struggled with choices about how to relate to nations in Africa facing such daunting challenges. Initially in 2001, she was appointed Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council. From there, she became the first woman to serve as U.S. Ambassador to South Africa. And in 2005, when Condi Rice became Secretary of State, she called Jindai back to become Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, the leading architect of U.S. African policy. Dr. Fraser has recently joined the faculty at Carnegie Mellon University as a Distinguished Service Professor and co-director of the Carnegie Mellon's new Center for International Politics and Innovation. Her current research focuses on strengthening regional security cooperation and economic and political integration in Africa. I would remind you that this event tonight is part of a series of Africa Week events that students across Harvard, including here at the Kennedy School, have organized. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Jindai Fraser back home to the Kennedy School and to the Forum.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. I very much appreciate that very kind introduction, and it is a great pleasure to be home here at the Kennedy School. Very much feels like my home still. I want to thank all of you for being here, and especially Dean Nye, although it's Joe Nye now, but it's really wonderful. Thank you very much for being here. And just to say to the students, I've organized many Africa Weeks myself when I was a student at Stanford, so I'm really very pleased to be here during your Africa Week. And what I'd like to do is to talk about some of the solutions that we found in the Bush administration. And I titled my talk, Solutions, a Transformative U.S. Africa Policy, because I feel that we spend a significant amount of our time discussing Africa's problems, and clearly there are a few, but this focus obscures the significant progress that has taken place in sub-Saharan Africa over the past decade. And so what I'd like to do tonight is to focus on the progress in the 4 areas of U.S. interest in Africa, namely health, economic development, conflict resolution, and governance, and then secondly outline some of the strategy and some of the key initiatives developed during the Bush administration to build a transformative Africa policy, including lessons learned on what succeeded and where we need more work, what didn't succeed as well. And then finally, I would like to conclude by suggesting what more is required of the Obama administration to advance and consolidate the progress that's taken place. When we think about U.S.-Africa interests, traditionally, practically every American administration has defined our interest in Africa broadly as to promote prosperity, peace, stability, and good governance. There's nothing new there. Certainly in the first term of the Bush administration, we really focused on the health, prosperity, and security stability side of those interests. And then in the second term, although we did start this in the first term, a more emphasis also on good governance. Obviously, good governance was there throughout, but if you even listen to President Bush's inaugural address during the second term, the democracy promotion took on much added weight during the second term. So when we look at, and what I'd like to do is talk to you about this. Some of this is not new, but to talk to you about this, the way it developed, the way the priorities, the strategy, and the initiatives actually developed. One of the areas that I mentioned or didn't mention in the traditional interests is health. Health became a major priority of our Africa policy because obviously the pandemic taking place in Africa with HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria, but especially HIV and AIDS. The scale of the pandemic demanded it to be a priority of U.S. foreign policy. Why I think our policy has been transformative and rather unique is that never before, once we developed the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief, never before has a single nation undertaken the financing on such a scale of an international health initiative. And this has implications for the future. We now have many, many people on antiretroviral drugs, significant amount of U.S. taxpayer dollars going towards it. How do we transform to a more sustainable base where the countries themselves can take over this financing? But before we get to that question, let's talk about how this evolved. The very first thing that happened, or one of the first things that happened, was Secretary Powell proposed to this very brand new White House that we create a cabinet council on HIV and AIDS. This was an innovation. There weren't any cabinet councils. This is in the very first week or second week at most of the Bush administration in 2001. I think, Paula, you may have had something to do with penning that memo for Secretary Powell to send over to the White House. We in the White House, they were saying, what's this cabinet council? Do we really want an institution like this? Why HIV and AIDS? Well, there was an early decision made in the White House by Condi Rice, by Andy Card, and by Josh Bolten, which said yes. Yes, we're going to have a cabinet council. And by that act, by that decision, we had an institution at the very senior levels of the U.S. government across different agencies now focused on international AIDS. The second big moment, I would argue, at least from my vantage at the White House at the NSC, was a recognition that we didn't have significant funding for HIV and AIDS. And here, the transition process is a very important one because I was the person at the NSC who interviewed the Clinton administration team that was leaving the NSC about what priorities were there. And the people in their International Economics Agency talked about they had just gotten $300 million passed for global HIV and AIDS internationally, but it wasn't sufficient. It wasn't sufficient. So we took up we took the baton from them and carried it towards getting significant more increase in financing for HIV and AIDS. And this was done by an idea that was floating out there in the policy environment. Basically, Kofi Annan had talked about a global fund for HIV and AIDS, TB, and malaria. At the same time that this idea was out there, this is now in the early part of 2001, there was a significant conference being held in Abuja, Nigeria, on HIV and AIDS. And we sent a representative to that conference, but we also then decided that we needed to try to pool international resources, so we accepted the idea of Kofi Annan for a global fund. And what President Bush did in, I believe it was May of 2001, so just 4 or 5 months into the administration, was to invite Kofi Annan, President Obasanjo, who had convened this major conference, as well as Senator Frist and some of the appropriators on the Hill, to the Rose Garden to announce that the U.S. government was going to put down $300 million on this idea of a global fund. He went further than that. The Secretary Rice and others chaired the Principals Committee's meetings. Now, again, you have a Cabinet Council, so you have Principal Committee meetings of Cabinet officials to talk about how to help structure the global fund. And members of our Health and Human Services Department, particularly a young man named Bill Steiger, was part of the process of developing the actual governance structure of the global fund. That $300 million contribution was doubled in June or July of 2001 as a result of the G8 conference in Genoa. And so now we have at least $600 million towards the idea of a global fund and staff working with others internationally and multilaterally to actually develop this idea, which is to pool resources. Well, today the U.S. government's pledge has pledged $3.5 billion, from the original $300 million to $3.5 billion of a pledge, and have provided $2.5 billion since 2001 to the Global Fund. The Global Fund is operating extremely well and has helped to save many, many lives. The second initiative, now we have money. The second initiative of the Bush administration was what was called, and no one pays too much attention to it now, but the Mother-to-Child Transmission Initiative. This was low-hanging fruit for us. Who could argue against trying to save the lives of unborn children? Essentially, there was an intervention, nevirapine. If you could give a mother nevirapine before childbirth, that would help that child to be born AIDS-free or HIV/AIDS-free. We developed this program focused on 15 African countries who had very high prevalence rates, who had large numbers of HIV-infected pregnant women, where CDC or USAID already had a presence, so we could implement the program very quickly, and where African leaders had demonstrated attention and focus on HIV and AIDS so that we would know that there would be accountable national leadership. Those were the criteria for selecting the countries. Clearly, the majority of the countries in that category were in Southern Africa, because that's really where the AIDS numbers were the highest, the prevalence rates were the highest. Also, Nigeria, a huge population, and they met all of the criteria. President Obasanjo, again, had held this major conference. Cote d'Ivoire was another one of the countries that fit into that category. That program proved successful. It was a building block towards getting to the PEPFAR program. And I think that this is very important when we're talking about establishing policy. It's small pieces that you succeed at that then provides confidence both for those in the administration who may be resisting the idea, as well as especially those on the Hill who are the appropriators of funding, to be able to believe that we can do more and do it effectively and do it accountably. That led to the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was, of course, the $15 billion program over 5 years that was announced in 2003. What are the lessons of this? And then it was reauthorized, I should say, in 2007 at $48.5 billion for a program that's going to go to 2013. What are the lessons of this process? I think the first and most important lesson, especially for establishing a transformative policy, is that it was based on an Africa model, the abstinence, be faithful, use condom model from Uganda. It was a program that was widely perceived as having been successful and was in fact successful. And so we had something that we knew actually worked, coming from Africa, developed in Africa. Secondly, and extremely importantly, President Bush's thinking on HIV/AIDS all along was very much influenced both by the medical doctors that we had and the scientists at HHS and at the National Institute of Health, but also by African leaders themselves. It was his interaction with people like President Mohai of Botswana and President Museveni of Uganda, which also helped convince him that, one, we needed a solution, we needed bold action, but there was also possibilities that that action would actually lead to results. So one of the things I would very much say to the Obama administration is that you got to meet with African leaders, and you need to do it early. You cannot develop a U.S.-Africa policy sitting in the White House or at the State Department in isolation from talking to African leaders on the ground, whether those are civic leaders, health leaders, political leaders, business leaders. You have to develop that policy in close collaboration, which would be a core element of a transformative policy, is very, very close collaboration with African leaders. So President Obama needs to meet with African leaders. That's essentially what I'm saying. He hasn't done it yet. He needs to meet with African leaders. We need to see an African leader in the Oval Office. It's a symbol, but it's also very significant for the quality of the policy that will come out. Secondly, you have to be careful of how you define an issue. During the Clinton administration, I was part of the Clinton administration, I was part of this, we very much defined AIDS as a national security threat. And we did that to elevate the attention, and we did it because we tied it to what was taking place in the Congo. Under the Bush administration, it was more defined as a health threat, and the policy was very much driven by people who were medical doctors and scientists like Tony Fauci, Joe O'Neill, and others. So how you define the problem has a major effect on the policy that you develop and the effectiveness of that policy. I won't go into the other health initiatives. I'll just mention them. They were so much easier to accomplish because of the success of PEPFAR. The President's Malaria Initiative, announced in 2005, committing $1.2 billion over 5 years to reduce by 50% mortality rates in 15 African countries. And then one that gets no attention at all, the Neglected Tropical Disease Initiative, which he announced in 2008 on his trip to Africa in February. It's more than $800 million to deal with such issues as river blindness and elephantitis. But those initiatives were far more easier to get through the bureaucracy, to get funding from Congress, and to get broad public support because of the success of PEPFAR. And the success of PEPFAR is because it was based on a model that actually worked in Africa. The second priority, economic development. Economic development. There are a lot of current debates right now in the international development policy. What's the role of foreign aid? You have people on both extremes. You have Jeff Sachs saying you have to increase it significantly. There's not enough money. There's not enough money. You have people like a new voice, Dambisa Moyo, essentially saying cut aid. In 5 years, get rid of it. It's debilitating African countries and governance and leaders. You have debates about the role of official development assistance versus private flows to finance development. You have the old debate about whether you should focus on inputs, high assistance, or outputs, results-based models. You have debates about whether growth is the key or is it poverty reduction. There's just a lot of debates in the international development policy arena. Well, what we did was make sure we hit all of them. we essentially developed what I would call a comprehensive results-based prosperity strategy. And here, the key and the core, based on the president's philosophy himself, was trade. Free markets, trade is a key. You remember that was very much President Bush's tone during the first term. And we had a piece of legislation that was actually passed during the Clinton administration, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. We were the first administration to implement what the Clinton administration had actually developed. So again, they passed us the baton, we took it and ran with it. Now there are 40 sub-Saharan African countries that are AGOA eligible. It essentially gives them duty-free access to the U.S. market for about 6,800 products. In 2007, over 98% of U.S. imports from AGOA-eligible countries entered our markets duty-free. Today, our two-way trade with Africa has nearly tripled since 2001 at $81.8 billion in 2007. The important part of this is that the trade advantages for Africa, they export to the U.S. market about $67.4 billion, whereas we export to them about $14.4 billion. The challenge here is, of course, that of the AGOA exports coming into our market, the majority of it is oil. The majority of it is oil. Only out of $51.1 billion in 2007 that was AGOA-specific exports to the U.S. market, only $3.46 billion of that was non-oil products. So we have to do a lot more in terms of diversification of the products. And with 6,800 tariff lines, certainly there is the incentive for African economies to diversify. U.S. foreign direct investment rose 52% from 2001 to 2006 at only, though, $13.8 billion. $13.8 billion. That's terrible. That's not good at all. On the trade side, I firmly believe that we have to do more in terms of African diversification. We have removed a lot of the non-trade or non-tariff barriers to trade. But there's a lot more that the African countries themselves have to do, which involves trade capacity building on our part. But a key next step is the World Trade Organization Doha negotiations, where we need to really eliminate ag subsidies. And I'll tell you the truth, the U.S. put a proposal on the table for the complete elimination of ag subsidies. And the Europeans and others blocked us, and the Africans didn't weigh in. They stood on the sidelines. That's unacceptable. If we're going to have a transformative Africa policy, when we put proposals out there, or anyone puts a proposal out there that's to the advantage of Africans, they can't stand on the sidelines. You know, that old metaphor that, when elephants fight, the grass suffers and get out of the way. And no, get in the fight. Get in the fight. So trade was one key component of our policy towards economic development, and it's a sustainable one. We also looked at increasing official development assistance. It was under $1 billion for 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa in 2001. We've done well, not well enough. We've gotten it up to $6.7 billion in 2008. But that's not the key. The key isn't the amount of money, it's what's done with the money. And our philosophy was you need to make ODA more effective and focused on measurable results. Hence, when we went to the Monterey Conference on Financing Development, we insisted on a compact that said that as donors increase the funding, the recipients will increase the accountability for that funding. And we established a new institution, a new way of doing assistance with the Millennium Challenge account, which today is provided about $3.9 billion to 8 African countries that have met certain criteria on good governance, on investing in health and education, and on good macro and microeconomic policies. Economic freedom is how we describe it. I can go in greater detail in Q&A if you'd like to know. But the point is that as far as a transformative policy, we have a new institution, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is focused on creating compacts with African countries, and that is results focused for what they think are the necessary sectors of their economies that can be assisted in a way that will lead to sustainable economic development. That is the philosophy behind the MCC, and it's intended to be focused on the best performing countries. So it's a new way of doing assistance. The third area that we worked on was debt cancellation. The Jubilee campaign was making a lot of noise, a lot of effective noise. This is where civic engagement and NGO activism is extremely important. During the second debate, President Bush, who was then Governor Bush, was asked, what are you going to do about poverty in Africa? And one of his answers was, we need to relieve the debt of African countries. Well, we fought major battles. He had promised it. We were going to deliver on it. Eventually, in June 2001, he went a step further. He went to the World Bank and he said, we need to stop all debt. We need to give all new assistance to African countries in the form of grants, not in the form of loans, because we're just contributing to the debt unsustainability that these countries are experiencing. So it was a move to, and now all of U.S. assistance to the World Bank is given out by the World Bank in the form of grants. We then negotiated the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, which essentially has reduced the debt of many African countries to about $40 billion. What's the key in terms of continuing to have a transformative policy? I'm not so sure here. I think there's a real problem because we relieved all this debt. We cleared the balance sheet for many of these countries, and now they're taking on more debt. They're particularly taking it on with China, and it's not transparent. It's not at all transparent. Now, on the one hand, you want to say, yes, we've relieved the debt, countries should not take on more debt, but on the other hand, countries do need to take on debt. That's part of what countries do. It's responsible action of countries. They take on debt, especially in the international bond market and other places. So you don't want to deny them that, but on the other hand, you're saying, but wait a minute, we've just gotten rid of all this debt, now you're accumulating it. So I don't know that philosophical question, but what I do know is that China providing all this debt needs to be part of the Paris Club so that there's greater transparency about what it's doing. I firmly believe that getting China into these institutions and therefore making it a responsible stakeholder in this system would be to the advantage of all of us, to China's advantage, to Africa's advantage, and to the other donors' advantage as well. The outcome of this, when I talk about that there's been significant progress in Africa on the economic development, I didn't say it on the HIV/AIDS side, I should have said it. More than 1.7 million people are now on antiretroviral drugs. That was the focus of the PEPFAR program, was to get people on antiretroviral drugs. And there was just a study done by Stanford scholars that came out today that said at least 1.1 million lives have been saved because of PEPFAR, reducing the mortality rate by 10% in the 12 African countries that are part of the PEPFAR program. That is significant. What it also said is that we've been much less effective in preventing HIV and AIDS. We've done well in the treatment side, but we've not done well at all on the prevention side, which means that the next team, the Obama team, needs to put a lot of focus on prevention, and we need greater innovation and effective programs on the prevention side. On the economic development side, economic growth in Africa was at an 8-year high. 20 countries in 2007 registered growth for the past 5 years. In 2007, sub-Saharan Africa's economic growth was estimated at 6.1%. It was the fastest growth in more than 3 decades, and it was a growth across all regions, both oil exporting and oil importing countries. So that's rather robust growth rates. But the flip side of that story, in terms of fast growth, is that sub-Saharan Africa still only accounted for 1.7% of world trade, 1.74% of world trade. That's not good at all. Total African exports were $208 billion in 2006, and imports were $243 billion in the same year. And so Africa's trading at a deficit, and it's not a major part of global trade today. So again, diversification of African economies, greater foreign direct investment is going to be necessary. This is not good numbers in the current environment, right? Because there's not a lot of investment out there, especially on the private side today. And so we're really faced, Africa really is faced, when the global economy is contracting, Africa is really going to be faced with major challenges to keep its growth rates at the 6% level. And in fact, to really reduce poverty, they need to be over 10%. So the story on the economic development side has quite a ways to go. And then finally, I've talked about the health, I've talked about economic development. I'll quickly go over conflict resolution and then governance, and then I will open it up to questions. On the conflict resolution side, I think that we've done well in that there were 6 major wars in 2001, and we've moved towards the consolidation of democratic transitions in several of them. Liberia, you had a war that is now ended, and you had the first woman president elected in 2006, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Sierra Leone, you had a war that ended, and you had the election, the second election of the president in 2007 from the opposition party this time. That's important progress. In Angola, you had the war end, and you had parliamentary elections, the first elections in a very long time in 2008. In Burundi, we stopped the genocide. It's a common misperception, especially among the Save Darfur crowd and the Enough people, that President Bush said, there will be no genocide on my watch, and he was talking about Rwanda. They're wrong. He actually wrote that in a memo that was talking about Burundi. He was saying at that time, I don't want to see a genocide in Burundi. We need policy interventions to stop a genocide in Burundi. And in fact, we've done that. They've done that. The region has done that. South Sudan is another major conflict that came to an end, but we had the situation obviously take place in Darfur. And then the Congo also ended a war, an interstate and a civil war, in terms of all of the countries that were there. I think about 7 or 8 countries were actually engaged in a war in Congo, plus 3 rebel groups. And that led to the first real democratic election in July 2006. Unfortunately, we have a huge crisis going on in eastern Congo today still. Those are the major wars that came to an end that were there in 2001. Some others broke out. Cote d'Ivoire broke out. It's pretty much ended, but they haven't gone towards a democratic election. They haven't transitioned to a democratic election. What have been some of the keys in terms of, again, a transformative Africa policy? One, in every single one of these crises, we worked with African mediators. People don't know that. People think that the United States negotiated the North-South Agreement. We played a major role, but Kenya, it was a Kenya mediator that actually negotiated the North-South Agreement. On the Liberia War, it was actually a Ghanaian and Nigerian mediators who negotiated the end of that war. On Burundi, it was Tanzanian and South Africans who negotiated the end. In Congo, it was South Africans who negotiated the end of that war. In every single one of these cases, we worked very closely with African mediators. Secondly, we worked very closely with the sub-regional organizations that were relevant in each of these conflicts. Thirdly, we worked very hard to train African peacekeepers because they're often the ones who were first ready to intervene. The UN takes a very long time to get there. African troops are typically ready to go early. They simply can't sustain themselves over time. They need UN support and assistance over the long run, but in the first instance, they're there. We, again, took a program that was based from the Clinton administration, the Africa Crisis Response Initiative, ACRI. We took that program and transformed it into the Africa Contingency Operations Training Assistance, ACOTA program. The difference between ACRI and ACOTA was funding, and we gave more robust assistance or more robust training capability to African forces, because ACRI was based on Chapter 6 peacekeeping missions. There's an agreement, the forces have separated, and you're not having to enforce the agreement, you're just monitoring. Whereas we were seeing more and more scenarios in Africa where the peacekeepers themselves were coming under attack, as well as civilians were coming under attack. So we wanted Chapter 7, where the peacekeepers had the mandate and the capability to protect civilians and to protect themselves in situations of peace enforcement, i.e. Not a situation where the forces, the countries have agreed and are implementing the agreement according to the terms of the agreement. We've trained since 2005 about 105,000 peacekeepers in Africa. What do we need to do now going beyond these programs? I think working to help build the African Union standby brigades is critically important. We also need to continue to work with African mediators and sub-regional organizations. I think it would be a mistake for the United States to put itself out there as the lead mediator. There's always a push to do so. The United States has to be responsible. Do something, you need to do something more. I think it's important for stability and sustainability in Africa to actually work with African mediators, not necessarily take the lead. It's important to know that Africans are very much doing their part. 4 African countries in particular, Ethiopia, Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa, are among the top 10 UN troop contributing countries for peacekeeping operations worldwide. And so Africans are stepping up. We should continue to support them, but I don't think we should take the lead, although sometimes you feel that you need to. And I think that this is a debatable point. And I would love to have some feedback. And then finally, the last area is governance. And again, the story is good, but it's not consolidated. And I like to just point out one indicator of progress that's been made over the last decade, and that's a Freedom House indication, which in 2001, Freedom House had classified 54% of African countries as not free, 33% as partly free, and 12% as free. In 2008, Freedom House had now classified from 54% not free was down to 29% not free. Partly free had gone up to 48%, and free had gone up to 23%. And so essentially, in 2008, you now had 71% of the countries classified as either free or partly free, and only 29% classified as not free. I think that that's an objective indicator that suggests that there's been good progress on the democracy and governance side. I know that elections don't make for governance, but it is an indicator. That said, we've had reversals. We've had reversals at the end of 2008, at the beginning of 2009. We all knew things were not going to go well in Guinea when Conté died. Why didn't we do something to prevent a coup d'etat? We all knew it was coming, but we didn't mobilize ourselves to actually prevent it from happening. We also had a coup in Mauritania. We had a coup, then we got a democratic government, then we had another coup. I think we were all in the right place in terms of everyone is isolating that government, but nevertheless, it's a reversal. In Mauritania today, you see the chaos that's taking place on the streets of Mauritania, where the public went out, pushed out the president. President now has his forces in the street trying to push out the new leader. So what do we need to do to consolidate and to have a transformative policy on governance? Strengthen civil society is very clear. Strengthen the free press, very important for accountability. I think that we need to move towards norms of respecting term limits and actually having term limits established as regional norms. Strengthen electoral commissions. The AU in particular, I think, is going to be a site for policy innovation here. The NAPAD peer review mechanism is one part of that, but the AU is also very clearly saying that it's going to reject coups and unconstitutional changes. They won't let leaders who come to power through that means sit in their councils at the AU. And so if they can move towards a norm of term limits and actual implementation of term limits, I believe that it will actually help on the governance as well as on the stability and conflict resolution side. So to conclude, why do I call it a transformative policy? Mainly because we established institutions, whether it's the MCC or the PEPFAR or the ACOTA. They're institutions that will carry on to the next administration, important institutions that have demonstrated effective results. Secondly, I think it's transformative because the levels of funding have never been higher. That doesn't mean they can't be reversed, so that certainly is not institutionalized, but I think it was transformative. But most importantly, because the entire philosophy of the policy was based on working very closely with Africans. As Condi Rice had said, and she talked about her transformational diplomacy, she talked about working with African peoples and governments to assist them to meet their own challenges, create their own opportunities, and build their own nations. And that really is at the heart of the spirit of a transformative U.S. Africa policy. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So, thank you. So according to our tradition, we get you to line up. Let me ask Joe Nye, if I can, to ask the first question, if possible. Joe was the dean when Jendai was recruited to come here and was mentioned. The ground rules are one question per customer, and every topic is open, but we have only one speaker tonight, so questions have to be brief. Joe.
Well, Jendai, welcome back. We're truly proud of you and what you've done, and I must say that I was not a supporter of the Bush administration. I think that your area is one where they truly did distinguish themselves for the reasons that you gave tonight. But having praised you and what the administration did, let me ask the questions a little bit more, if I could. Tell us a little bit more about the failures, and I think particularly of Darfur and Somalia.
You want to know about Darfur and Somalia? Yes.
And again, each of these would be lectures, but just short answers if possible. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. On Darfur, I think Darfur is a very unfortunate circumstance. Darfur is an example where our approach didn't work at all. And why? I have to sit back and think about Darfur a little bit longer. I don't have enough distance from it. But you know, I could say a lot of nasty things about the government in Khartoum. It's a tactical government. It's a very tactical government. Let me talk about myself. I think that's the best way to do it. I was convinced when we negotiated and worked on the North-South agreement with the Kenyans and others that this government had changed and that it had decided fundamentally that its approach to marginalize the other regions was not going to work, and that it had, in negotiating that agreement, was choosing a path of collaboration and dialogue with its citizens rather than that brute force, you know, just stamp out any insurgency. I believe that. And so I think that there is a certain degree to which when the conflict was taking place in Darfur, we were concluding the agreements on the North-South, and we were hoping that the government would respond the way they were doing on the North-South. We were hoping that they would accept some type of mediation process with Darfur. We were surprised at how brutal that counterinsurgency actually was. And it goes beyond counterinsurgency at this point. And so I think, one, I miscalculated, and I would say we miscalculated, but I miscalculated in terms of an expectation that this was a different government, now that it had gone through a learning experience with the North-South. So that's the first thing. The second, in terms of the response, I did leave and go to South Africa. And so there was a period in which I wasn't at State or the White House, but I do know that we worked very closely with the African Union to get African Union troops to go in as an emergency response. And the African Union forces went in, I think at the beginning of 2005, airlifted in by the U.S. and NATO. And actually, the violence decreased significantly during that period of time. Again, we were pushing towards negotiation, right? To get the government, get the rebel groups to negotiate. by the end of 2005, I'd say August to the end, and I know I have to be short, but by the end of 2005, violence had increased significantly. This wasn't primarily government-sponsored violence. This was the rebel groups dividing themselves. And so a lot of that violence was coming from the rebel groups. Now, the government is ultimately responsible. The government has carried out the most egregious violence, but the rebel groups themselves have some responsibility in this. Abdul Wahid and Mini Manawi, they divided, then they divided, and then they divided. It's to the point where at some point you had 23 different rebel groups. The African Union did its best. We always, our strategy was to get the UN to take over from the African Union very quickly. The UN didn't want to go. I just have to say this very clearly. They absolutely did not want to go to Darfur, and so they did all of the, and I'm talking about the Secretariat, all of the dragging their feet that was possible. Eventually, we got a Security Council resolution passed. It was rejected by the Sudanese. And you can't get peacekeeping forces. This is something that people need to realize. You can't get countries to give peacekeeping forces to go to a country where there is a government still intact that says we don't want you here. It's very difficult. That issue of sovereignty is a big, huge hurdle that we have to overcome. And the way the AU interpreted this, the follow-on peacekeeping operation was that they had to have the permission of the Sudanese government. And that, I think, was a bit of a mistake. We did do some calculations about a no-fly zone. And ultimately the decision was taken not to do a no-fly zone, partly, as President Bush himself says very publicly, because the humanitarian organizations were saying, if you do a no-fly zone, we're going to get kicked out of here. So don't do a no-fly zone. There were other reasons. The U.S. military was absolutely opposed to this. There were some in State Department who were very much opposed to this. We were in an environment, especially now after Iraq, where, we're the United States is going to invade another Muslim country. You can't do a no-fly zone. There were talk about, well, Al-Qaeda will just mobilize if you put your forces into Darfur. The AU changed and started saying, we don't want NATO, it's neo-colonialism. And so the policy environment for a possible no-fly zone had evaporated, essentially. And we had an alternative which we thought would work, which was the UN. Now, the Obama administration came in, campaigned on a no-fly zone. And those of us who were handing them the baton showed them all of the policy work we had done and also what we had put in place if they would choose to actually pursue a no-fly zone.
Okay.
I didn't talk about Somalia,
No,
but...
we'll do that one later if we can. So
Somewhere
please,
else.
short questions and short answers. This
Yes.
gentleman. And introduce yourself. Yeah.
My name is Tarun Singh. I'm a junior at the college. Last summer, I worked for an NGO called Direct Relief International, and one of the things we try to do is try to build, bring accountability to people who are giving aid to make sure the aid that we're giving is effective. And we did that by creating an HIV prevalence model and seeing if it's geospatially correlated with WHO facilities. How would you recommend that the United States government give more incentive to NGOs to actually do this type of internal review to make sure that where they're giving aid in a particular country is the most effective place to give that aid?
Right. Well, I think the U.S. government is doing that through the Office of Global AIDS Coordinator in their country. This is essentially handled at the embassy level, at the country level. And there are interagency country teams in our embassies that put forward proposals for new funding to headquarters now, the Office of Global AIDS Coordinator. And typically, the requirements for those proposals are rather stringent, and they have these accountabilities. And so if you're doing it already, and you're doing it in particular countries, I would say link up with those country teams. But from what I understand, the requirements are so stringent that there are certain NGOs and groups that refuse to even take the money because they're saying sort of the accounting and the accountability criteria is just too high to meet. It would take too much staff time to do that.
Sure, but if you look at maps of countries like Cameroon, and you look at where the health facilities are located, they're largely located on highways or next to airports where it's most accessible for us to get there, but not necessarily in the regions which are suffering the most.
Yeah.
How do we like solve that issue?
Well, we do, I mean, look, I was ambassador to South Africa, and I was going all over the place, not just on highways, to get to, to get to some of these clinics. That said, I understand what you're saying, and I think that with, $48.5 billion, that's a lot of money to try to push out the door. One of the things we're supposed to be doing with that money is looking at building up more community-based, local community-based health organizations, whether it be NGOs or whether it be, local nurses, clinical workers and others. So I think that we have the money, we have the intention, and if, people like you can engage with OGAC or in the countries themselves, I think it can get done. But I think the spirit and the philosophy is already there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say this may be a good opportunity, after to do a note on how you would imagine that could be done, because Jendai certainly remains a significant voice. This lady in the loge, please.
Now, first of all, I would like to thank you for coming and talking to us today. It's a great pleasure to listen to you. My name is Rahma Adam. I'm a second-year MPP student here, and I'm also a research assistant at the Harvard Kennedy School African Index of Governance. And I have two related questions. The first question regards to development and stability of Africa. The more I work on the index and understanding Africa, I see the biggest problem lie in institutions. Lack of strong institutions, like we have weak judiciary systems, we have weak banking systems, and as we have seen, like the U.S. has been to develop because of this, develop hundreds of years, it has developed these strong institutions. So I was just wondering, like during your tenure or like in the future, what do you see as the role of the U.S. in developing institutions, strong institutions in Africa, so that Africans could be able to help themselves and become not only like an appendage, but a strong partner in the global economy? And another question is regarding, like, just recently I was looking at the website on the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and I just found that they give grants, like any NGO or CBO could apply to get grants to do democracy or governance work, or do HIV or AIDS prevention. And another thing was community work. But the community work was not like really specific. It was mostly targeted to like water or other initiatives for social entrepreneurship. And I was just wondering, like during your tenure or as you foresee in the future, do you think I think it will be better for the these embassies or the other agencies to be able to do community needs assessment survey to really understand what are the needs of the community before they put these 3 strict, sort of like proposals that you could apply for and not
I think
about.
we got it.
So-
Good.
Just quickly on that, I think you're right. Part of the reason that you get those areas, focused areas for funding is because a lot of our assistance is targeted, it's earmarked. I was watching David Letterman last night. I don't know if you all saw it, and he was doing earmarks. He was showing everybody talking about earmarks, but a lot of the funding is earmarked, for instance, water. And so we are given a certain amount of money from Congress because they feel that that's a priority area, and that's why one, we all know water is important, clean water is important, but that's part of the reason why you have that type of, specific targeted request for proposals in an area. But I do think that you're quite right. Needs-based assessment would be very helpful, and I'm sure the USAID is doing some of that. Secondly, on your question about institution building, we are doing it. I think it's a little ad hoc-ish. There's a lot of programs, for instance, to try to support parliamentarians and institutions, parliamentarian institutions. One of the things that the MCC does, especially what countries that don't quite qualify are threshold countries, where a lot of them are threshold countries because of issues of corruption. We're working on building accountability mechanisms in their treasury departments and other places, greater transparency, mechanisms for greater transparency. So we are doing it, but we don't have a comprehensive initiative that is focused with clear measurable results in that area, I don't think. But, Paula Dobriansky's here, and if you feel that there is, please Enlighten us.
I think a pill for institution building hasn't been invented yet, so I think that's a wonderful topic for people here at the school to research. This gentleman is next.
My name is John Minor. I'm originally from Kenya, and I'm sure I know you lived in Kenya for quite some time, so I know you know the political terrain in Kenya. I also know you were one of the members of the international community that came to intervene during our disputed 2007 elections, where we lost almost 15,000 people. And President Kibaki declared himself the president, although most of us believe the elections were rigged. What's your take on that? Do you believe President Kibaki was legitimately elected in Kenya? And do you think the coalition was the best way forward after in the post-election period, knowing that if you've been following the Kenyan news, you know already 2 members of the cabinet resigned yesterday. So do you think the coalition is working, and do you think President Kibaki was legitimately elected, or he rigged his way into the State House?
Good.
Yeah, sure. Do I think he rigged his way in? No. Do I think he's legitimate elected? Questionable. I think that the election was a good election. I think the problem came in the counting of the votes. And I put the greatest responsibility for that failure on the Electoral Commission and the commissioner, because it's the commissioner who, by the Kenyan Constitution, declares who wins the election. That's the Kenya Constitution. And so once the commissioner comes out and says, I declare this person has won, there's not a lot of recourse except for to go to the courts. If you're going, I'm talking about recourse in terms of the Constitution of Kenya. It's to go to the courts. The opposition said, we don't trust the courts. The president, elects he puts in place all of the judges. So we can't trust the court, so that remedy isn't available to us. We won't accept that remedy. So now you're outside of Kenya's constitution, right? You're outside of Kenya's constitution, so then what do you do? On the one hand, you have charges of, that this guy cheated his way into power, and then he went and, inaugurated himself. And then on the other hand, you have, these guys are mobilizing ethnic violence, in the Rift Valley and other places. The best choice, I think, that many felt at that point in time, because you couldn't have a new election immediately in that environment. You just simply couldn't have a new election, was to have this grand coalition, which Kofi Annan negotiated, was the mediator and negotiator of that grand coalition. Did anyone think that grand coalition would answer all of Kenya's problems? No. I don't think the problem is the grand coalition. I think the problem is the nature of Kenya's politics. That's the problem in Kenya. And I don't care what arrangement that you have, until you can change the way people practice the politics there, it's going to be very difficult. Kenya's been in a process of changing its constitution to decrease the power of the presidency, the office of the presidency, and many other types of transformations. But it's the leaders. The leaders aren't acting responsibly. There's others in this audience who have more information. But what my observation, I just came back from Kenya, is that the leaders don't act responsibly. The civil society has acted extremely responsibly in Kenya, and thank God for civil society there.
And that's exactly my question. The leadership is in question. In other words, President Kibaki's leadership should be in question, especially since he fired the ECK commissioner, the election commissioner. And when the election commissioner was fired, he actually disclosed and said those elections were rigged. So the president should not be there legitimately.
My problem with Kenya, and I'll just say it bluntly, is that I can't figure out what any of those leaders stand for. because they're constantly shifting coalitions. 1 minute they're with the one, and then they're against the other, and I think they just all want power. And so you point out President Kibaki, but I think it's the whole lot of them.
Okay, so you heard it from the State Department. So. Jindai now only speaks for herself, but I think you could hear her answer. This gentleman.
Hi, my name is Martin Gross, and I'm a second-year MPP student here at the Kennedy School. And my question is about PEPFAR and the PEPFAR program. So you've talked a little bit about some of the successes and some of the possible failures of PEPFAR. But in addition to criticisms around the effectiveness of the prevention strategies, there's also been criticisms about PEPFAR's approach to health system strengthening and strengthening the health systems within African countries, and that in fact, in many cases, it serves to weaken health systems. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that and whether you think the program should be restructured to have a greater focus on health system strengthening.
Well, yes, I do think it should, but I don't think it needs restructuring. It's going to happen with the new appropriation. That's part of the plan for the appropriation. And when we were designing PEPFAR, one of the things that fell out, but is actually in the legislation, and we actually helped put it in that legislation, was this issue of strengthening the health infrastructure. But there were no targets associated with that issue, so it sort of fell away. But how do you think it's actually weakening them?
By drawing away key human resources
Yeah.
for the most part, and basically by creating an entirely vertical aid
Yes.
system, which is much larger than the whole rest of the health system.
Yeah, I
combined.
think that's fair. That's very fair. Well, I know that with the $48.5 billion, they're supposed to, part of the target now is to strengthen health infrastructure. I don't know how it's going to be done, because I haven't been involved in that part of the reappropriation. But I know that was at least Mark Dybel's intention. They haven't yet, I think, announced a replacement for him.
This gentleman, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Murphy. I'm a student at the Fletcher School and at the Harvard School of Public Health, and a social entrepreneurship fellow here at the Center for Public Leadership. And I'd like some advice. So I am going into the Foreign Service this summer and hope to spend most of my career working in Africa. What advice could you give those of us who are going to work with the State Department or USAID or perhaps with UN agencies on how we can best work with counterparts in government in Africa? How should we approach our work starting out so that we can be most effective and build productive relationships?
Oh, good, that's an excellent question. If you're going to be on the counselor line, be nice to people. Say thank you and hello and how are you doing? Approach people as human beings, not someone trying to get you in trouble or get something out of you or get into America and, stay in America when, So, I think that's really important. I tell a story, and I'm going to do it now. In 1982, I was a student in Kenya, and there was an attempted coup d'etat. I was an American student, exchange student, and I didn't know what to do. There was a coup. My father was a military officer, and he said, well, what do you think you do? Go to the American embassy, of course. Well, I went to the American embassy, and the Marine chased me away. He said I wasn't an American. I had taken on a Kenyan accent because I had been just deeply, embedded in the student life there, and when I went to be ambassador to South Africa, I said to my mission, I don't want to hear stories like that, not just about American citizens, but about anybody, So that's the first thing: is be polite, Ask people how they're doing, when they approach you. Don't yell at them through the window. Don't be mean. Secondly, I think that getting out to the degree that you can, because it's not always easy outside of the American community, and actually building friendships. And I know that that's somewhat discouraged by diplomatic security. When you start doing your security clearances, they want to know who do you know and what have you been doing with them. But try to get outside of the embassy walls and actually make friendships with, because those are your contacts. That's both professionally, it's information, but it's information that's not just specific to an interest, but also an understanding of the culture and of the society. And so the thing that I would say the most is human skills. interpersonal skills. And, you know, as a Foreign Service officer, develop your interpersonal skills. You know, be nice to people in the building, be nice to people in the countries that you're serving in.
Thank you very much.
Good question and good answer, please.
Thank you. My name is Brighton Muzingwa, and I'm a senior in the college. You spoke about the importance of diplomacy and engaging African leaders. And my question is with regards to the nature of the diplomatic tone that you took when you were working in the Bush administration. Specifically, last year you were very vocal in criticizing the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and you came out saying that you declared that he had lost the elections last year. What is your response to critics who argue that this type of confrontational, abrasive approach to African leaders has only hardened their stances, their insistence on their sovereignty, as well as propagating their perception that Western governments support opposition parties, and hence undermining opposition and hence democracy on the continent in that case?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, let me say that before I was Assistant Secretary, Robert Mugabe was beating down his population. So nothing that I said had anything to do with what Robert Mugabe was doing. Secondly, you can't find a single statement that I made about Zimbabwe in which I was disrespectful to Robert Mugabe. What I was saying is that he had lost the first round. That's established. That's a fact. And I said it because we knew that we knew where the Electoral Commission had already established that he lost. Do you remember there was a long period of time between when the results were supposed to be announced and when they were actually announced? There was a lot of concern at that point that they were doing funny business there, trying to change the results. We knew that he had lost. The Electoral Commission knew that he had lost. And so my saying it was intended to let them know and everyone know that we know what the results are. And so I don't think that that's a disrespectful statement. I do believe that it was confrontational, but it was a last resort confrontational. We had waited and we had talked to the South Africans and the Southern African Development Community countries for years about putting greater pressure on Robert Mugabe, given the situation that was taking place in that country. And unfortunately, they weren't getting there. They simply weren't getting there. And so at some point, we had to assert ourselves publicly. In fact, we even listened to the South Africans who had said to us, you know, when I was ambassador to South Africa and before that, you guys just be quiet because you're playing into Robert Mugabe's hands. Whether we said something or didn't say something, he continued to have oppressive policies towards his population. So I would say that we weren't a major factor, whichever way, whether speaking out or staying quiet. It didn't have the effect of, or it developed any leverage over his action.
Thank you.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have time for only two last questions, this lady, and then we have to stop. Thank you. Please,
Great,
short
thank
questions and short answers.
Sure. My name is Allison Lombardo. I'm a second-year student in the MPP program here at the Kennedy School. We talked a little bit about Darfur in the past, and I was hoping you could talk about it moving forward in the veil of the Transformative U.S. policy toward Africa. Specifically, now that foreign aid agencies are out of the country and the humanitarian crisis is worsening, what can and should the U.S. do moving forward?
Well, I'm not in government anymore, so I can't speak my mind. And I think we made a mistake in not trying to put a no-fly zone in place. I think that it was a decision made at a high level. I understand it. I don't know that whether we did it or didn't, what the result would be. You can't say that would have been, you know, the answer any more than the choices that we took. But I took the Obama administration or the Obama campaign on their word that they were going to put a no-fly zone in place. And so I'm looking for the no-fly zone. You know, I mean, there's, you know, there are no humanitarian workers there anymore. This is a government that continues. You know, I remember at one point, Kofi Annan, gosh, it was in, I don't want to go too far in the back, but I think it was in 2006 or 2007, where the government said, don't worry, we don't need UN peacekeepers, we have a solution to the problem in Darfur, and that solution was a major military mobilization. I think you can do a no-fly zone. I think it's feasible, and I think that that's what I would look for, is the implementation of a no-fly zone.
Last question, please.
I'm Pearl Robinson. I'm a professor at Tufts where I teach African politics. And I know Professor Frazier.
Yes, indeed.
I've got one factual question, and then it's a question about the overall framing of your remarks. What are the 8 countries that have Millennium Challenge account money? And then the larger question, if I understood the overall approach that you had, it sounded very much to me like a multilateral approach. And you were in an administration that was very unilateralist. It sounded like a multilateral approach where the multilateral partners are African partners primarily, not U.S. sort of Western allies. If I am correct in that perception, would you explain to me how you were able to do that in the Bush administration?
Sure. You are correct. I'm looking for the 8 countries right now. I can name some of them off the top, but I wanted to try to get the full set. But let me answer the second question and come back to the first as I keep looking. And thank you for the question. First of all, of course, I would say that the idea that we were unilateralists is overstated. And I think that it's partly our fault for that perception, because we were sort of robust in our language. But almost in every single situation that I can think of, whether it's North Korea or Iran or Iraq or any of these other issues, we worked with other governments, and we worked closely. Now, we led, but we worked very closely with other governments. We got the tag, I think, of being unilateralist because of Kyoto, a very early decision of the administration and the way we went about it. And I think that, you know, we took a hit because of that. So I think that we were multilateral in general. But yes, indeed, on our Africa policy, we were self-consciously multilateral. And you're quite correct in picking up that we spent a lot of time building those relationships with African countries and institutions. This troubled, to some degree, the European countries. We did work with the European countries, but I remember one diplomat said, Jendai Fraser has no time for Europeans. You know, and I'm like, well, that's not true. I come to these, you know, U.S., Europe bilateral talks all the time. You know, I engage in it. But my view of it was pragmatic, which is you got to deal with the people on the ground. You know, the people who, the Europeans can help you leverage something, right? When you're going to do sanctions against Zimbabwe, you need the Europeans and others to be on board with that. You need the Chinese to be on board with that as well. You know, so you can work. They can help leverage, but in terms of solving the problem, actually getting in there and figuring out the solutions, I found that the people closest to those problems are best able to do the analysis and come up with the solutions. And that's why I tended to work very, very, very closely with Africans. Plus, it was our philosophy. You know, it was a philosophy of Africans have, as President Bush would say it somewhat inarticulately, Africans are plenty capable. You know? And we don't need that you know, paternalism. We don't need to have a paternalistic attitude. And so it was a departure. It was a bit of a departure. In the past, there's been a tendency to try to work Africa through Europe, whereas I felt we should just work Africa directly with Africa and of course, try to coordinate with European countries and coordinate with China. We did have this senior dialogue with China, and we actually moved our policy. We actually fund some of the construction projects that China's doing in Africa, particularly their road building, because they're so effective at it for infrastructure development. We're working with them on health projects, and so we've established more of a relationship with China as well. But so yes, you're right in your observation, but I don't think you're right in the notion that the Bush administration was unilateralist and somehow I had to work against the tide. In fact, it was part of the philosophy and the approach. And we just got an unfair shake in the press. The press just got it wrong. That's the way I would put it. On the 8 or 9 countries, I couldn't find a piece of paper that had them listed, but from memory, Tanzania, Ghana, Mali, Madagascar, which is now out now, Benin, Burkina Faso, I think, was also MCC, Cape Verde. I'll give you the list.
Okay, I'll go on.
Yes.
I really wanted the answer to that last question, so thank you.
Yes.
So on behalf of an enlightened audience, let's say thank you to Jendai Fraser.